A skiff that carried me toward the reef moved as though reluctant. Its cedar ribs groaned each time the swell lifted us, and the old fisherman at the tiller spat into the foam, whispering apologies to the water he had known all his life. I tasted brine on my lips while the horizon shuddered with mirage heat, and I searched for any sign of the structure that had tempted me halfway across the world. There, where turquoise turned to an opalescent white, something jagged and pale breached the sea's skin. Even from miles away I could see that the object rose unnaturally straight, a tower where no masonry should survive, each facet glittering like calcified lightning. "That is the coral clock," the fisherman muttered. "Don't stare too long, it stares back." He spoke the island tongue, but the dread in his voice travelled without translation. When I had arrived at his village the night before, money had meant little. My curiosity was the price that troubled him. The elders had argued. One warned I would bring misfortune by stepping onto sacred reef. Another insisted I might finally record the proof outsiders needed. In the end, the sea decided for them. A tremor in the tides had been felt during the previous dusk, what they called a hesitation in the water's pulse. Traditional law said that when such a hesitation came, someone must visit the tower before the next moonrise to listen for the verdict. Not a single youth volunteered, so they handed the duty to me, a stranger with too many notebooks and too much eagerness, believing, perhaps hoping, that I would hear nothing and return with ignorant assurances. As our skiff closed in, I began to discern the tower's anatomy. It was neither pure coral nor dead limestone. Spiraling ridges formed a continuous staircase, yet each step resembled the ribs of living sea fans. Their colours shifted with depth, crimson at the base, peach higher up, then bone white near the air. No birds nested on it, no algae filmed its flanks. It was as though the thing borrowed time only from the ocean and refused any other debt. The fisherman cut the engine. We drifted inside a lagoon ringed by tiny, flower-like polyps, shimmering in lazy currents. "If you climb," he said, "remember the story. The tower keeps the ocean honest. But the ocean doesn't like honesty." Then he produced a conch shell wrapped in banana leaves. "Take it, knock once when you reach the first window. The coral will let you pass." He would not explain further. I slung my pack, stepped onto a tongue of reef, and found the surface surprisingly warm, almost mammalian. The moment my shadow crossed the tower's base, a vibration thrummed through my soles, scaling my spine toward my skull. One heartbeat. Then, another. The rhythm was neither mine nor human. It was like the measured strike of a colossal drum, muffled by distance, each beat arriving with a half-second delay, as if travelling through thousands of miles of submerged chambers. A low aperture opened beside me, petals of coral folding away without fracture. I pressed the conch against the inner lip. The vibration fled up the shell to my wrist, transformed into a chime so soft I doubted my senses until the aperture widened. I stepped inside. Sunlight poured through lacework walls, projecting shifting maps across the floor. There were no stairs. The interior was a whirlpool of suspended ledges, each connected by narrow isthmuses. The architecture of Nautilus dreams. As I climbed, the myth the elders had hurriedly recited to me the previous night returned, now fleshed by the tower's own murmured recollections. Long before any cartographer charted these seas, before even the ancestors of the islanders paddled their outriggers from star to star, there lived a craftsman named Olaun. He was neither man nor fish entirely, but a child of both. Born during a midnight storm when the sea exchanged gifts with the shore. Fresh conch for new blood, moonlit eggs for woven nets. Olaun learned to carve tide bones, the chalky exoskeletons left by giant clams, and his sculptures sang when the south wind roared. Because he loved two mothers, land and ocean, Olaun vowed to prevent them from warring. Whenever the currents plotted siege against the forests, he listened for the first note of betrayal and warned the villagers. But the oceans, as the elders said, are old sovereigns. They do not enjoy spies. They conjured tempests to shatter Olan's ears, commanded vortices to swallow his craft. Every time, Olan floated ashore clinging to driftwood, and each time he carved a new instrument that pierced deeper through the water's deceit. Finally, in fury and admiration, the sea itself approached him in the guise of a ripple-skinned queen. She offered him a bargain. Create one final sentinel beautiful enough to seduce even her own storms, and she would cease hunting him. Fail, and she would drown not only him but the memory of him. Olau laboured for 90 tides. He dove where no lungs could last and harvested living coral while whispering lullabies so gentle the colonies surrendered branches without pain. At low tide, he mixed mother-of-pearl dust with his blood to coat the structure's seams. He sculpted cavities tuned to every octave the ocean could utter. When it stood complete, the tower rose twice the height of the tallest palm, but only the uppermost windows surfaced during the lowest ebb. Its core was a vertical pulse rod of aragonite, sensitive enough to throb at the crush of Antarctic glaciers and the sigh of newborn lagoons. The Sea Queen approached to judge. She ordered her fiercest rogue wave one that had never been tamed by strand or cliff to strike. The tower vibrated, leaned and bent like a reed, yet resumed its form untouched. Within its chambers, crystal organ pipes boomed a single note, deep as volcanic vents. That note echoed across the archipelago. Recognizing her defeat, the Queen agreed. The tower would remain a mediator between her moods and the dreaming sand dweller. On nights when its resonance quickened, the villagers would understand that tides conspired toward betrayal, and they would retreat inland until the pulse calmed. What Orlaun did not expect was the cost of maintenance. The heartbeat he had captured was no simple metronome. It was the living tempo of the world's oceans, and binding it to coral required a guardian. Orlaun became that warden, dissolved into the tower piece by piece in the manner of coral polyps merging with colon. His consciousness spread through the lattice, counting time while singing lullabies for storms he could never again behold directly. The people mourned and revered him, and for many generations they obeyed every cadence the tower transmitted. Flash floods spared them. Cyclones missed the islands by strange margins. Neighbours accused them of harbouring witchcraft. They only pointed to the reef and said, "We just listen." Then came the century of forgetting. Traders brought steel hulls and compasses. Missionaries labelled the tower a pagan obelisk, a relic of superstition. A new port excavated a natural breakwater, changing the littoral flows. Concrete hotels rose where mangroves once buffered surges. Fewer bothered to interpret the tower's pulse. They could schedule tides in printed tables. Why heed the beating of imaginary hearts? So when the rhythm slowed one equatorial spring night, the warning went unheralded. 3 dawns later, a wall of water taller than stories roared through the bay. Tourists captured its gleam on film just before it took them. Coconut trunks gouged roofs. Gravel became shrapnel. The port's foundations sank by 1/2 metre. Only the oldest generation understood what the tower had tried to say. The ocean had withheld part of its ebb, fattening itself for a feast. Shame germinated among survivors. They mended canoes the old way and walked barefoot on the reef, listening. The tower forgave, but did not forget. Its beat resumed, though few could interpret its subtler syncopations. The eldest died with the secret tongues still half nested in their throats. This history unravelled in my memory while I climbed. I had come to study acoustic eco-architecture, expecting to find a natural curiosity, but each platform I ascended turned my skepticism translucent. The beat inside the walls was not metaphor. It shifted tempo as I advanced, as if welcoming or measuring me. Once it skipped and doubled, like palpitation. I reached the highest intact chamber, which overlooked a cradle-blue vastness. There I saw the mechanism. Glassy rods thicker than thighs hung from ceiling to floor. They shimmered with planktonic motes and flexed with every distant swell. Touching one cooled my fingertips as though soaked in meltwater. Through that rod I heard, rather than felt, vibrations mapping unknown distances. The carving of a far iceberg, maybe, or the slide of continental shelves caressing magma. Cold breath touched my nape. A voice, neither male nor female, whispered, "Do you know how to count what you hear?" I spun around. No figure stood behind me. The voice came again, not through air, but through the aragonite. I placed my palm upon it and closed my eyes. I replied, unsure whether I spoke aloud. "Then learn quickly. The sea is plotting betrayal. Images, abstract yet urgent, unfurled inside my skull. I sensed a tidal theme swelling in the east, a stacked wave phenomenon, multiple storms on different oceans synchronizing their surges would send a pulse underneath, rolling across trenches, gathering amplitude where offshore construction had trimmed natural shallow. It would arrive within 2 nights, disguised at first by docile currents, then pounce on the sleeping coast. My rational mind insisted I was hallucinating, influenced by history and the tower's ambience. Yet the data felt precise. Numbers, coordinates, wave periods. I remembered that the fishermen's village sat barely 3 meters above high tide. They needed hours, not days, to evacuate. My watch showed noon. I descended, heart banging in concert with the structures. Outside, the fishermen saw my face and began rowing before words emerged. When I finally spoke, telling him of what I had learned, he did not question me. He only rowed faster. News of an approaching swell never gains trust easily in paradise. The mayor, a portly man in a pressed uniform, reminded us that forecasts predicted calm. The radio said nothing about storms, yet the fishermen's neighbours recognised the urgency in his silence. They remembered the cost of ignoring a living metronome. An informal alert spread. Drums beaten with conch mallets, garlands hung upside down from door frames, cooking fires extinguished. Children ferried the message to inland plantations. Tourists hesitated until they saw locals packing altars and chickens onto trucks. Night fell, with a flat calm so profound it mocked our haste. The lagoon mirrored constellations perfectly. A resort manager demanded that the evacuation order be retracted, threatening lawsuits for lost revenue. Be retracted, threatening lawsuits for lost revenue. He slept on the beach chair to prove his point. Shortly after midnight, the ground underneath him quivered. The sand retreated in a gulping hiss. Those awake heard a boom, low, sustained, like cannon fire muffled by distance. No wind stirred, yet the palms leaned inland as if anticipating impact. I imagined the tower at that moment, its pulse accelerating. If Olaun's consciousness persisted, he must have been thrumming warnings through every polyp skeleton until cracks spidered the stone. But the lagoon lay too far for the villagers now. They could not hear the tower itself, only trust the echo of its edicts filtered through me. The tsunami arrived as a bruised wall, its face lit by moonlight, crowned with debris, segments of prop water, an uprooted pier, glints of propeller. It roared across the empty market, swallowing the resort in silence, because the sound of its passage trailed behind, arriving after destruction like late applause. The manager on his chair vanished without even a splash. Yet inland, where trucks had ferried children and elders to limestone ridges, thousands watched the water rampage through coconut groves that hours before shaded hammock naps. They watched, and they lived. When dawn exposed the wreckage, some wept, some simply knelt. I walked among them, with a notebook untouched, because no language I possessed could annotate that mixture of loss and relief. 2 days later, the sea lay placid again, as though nothing had happened. Bulldozers cleared splinters of bungalow, aid ships anchored, consultants in hard hats inspected fault lines. They recorded insufficient data to explain the surge's ferocity. Their models spoke of minor pressure anomalies. Quietly, some officials suggested exaggeration. that perhaps locals had panicked and thus saved themselves from a wave smaller than memory claimed. I hiked back across the exposed reef at dawn, alone. The tower stood unchanged, but when I pressed my ear to its base, its heartbeat faltered, as if the strain of shouting had wounded it. I knocked with the conch. A fissure opened reluctantly, no wider than a coin. "Alone," I whispered. "They heard you." The beat answered in slow triplets, bittersweet. I felt gratitude and fatigue. The coral closed around my fingers in a gesture like farewell, then the aperture sealed, leaving my hands smelling of moss and iron. Back in the village, carpenters drafted plans. They would build a raised pavilion, connected to the reef by floating bridge, so that in the next generation, children could stand closer and memorize the heartbeat's cadence. They asked whether I would write down the patterns, translate them into charts accessible even to those without seawater in their blood, I agreed, though I doubted translation alone would suffice. The tower's message was visceral. You felt it first, understood later. Before I departed, the fisherman gave me the conch. "A shard of the tower's voice," he said, "in case you travel where its song cannot reach." In airports and subways, I keep the shell wrapped in my bag. Occasionally, I press it to my ear among the roar of engines and announcements. The most times, I hear only the hush of my own pulse. But now and then, especially when a news ticker mentions strange tide patterns, I detect a distant throb matching no vessel's engine. Each time it happens, I mark it on a map comprised of longitudes, dates, volumes. Yet another attempt to quantify awe. Eventually, I share the coordinates with whoever still trusts myths. I do not worry whether coastal councils believe us. The tower will keep counting whether we listen or not, and one day its patience may expire. Walking shoreline at dusk, I sometimes imagine Olaun's silhouette woven into the horizon, head bowed, still attuned to turbulences beyond sonar charts. He gave his body to coral so that land and ocean might converse without bloodshed. It seems the least I can do to lend my own fragile voice as relay. The reef is off limits now except for ceremonial visits. Children practice the old knocks on coconut trunks until they can play the heartbeat's 3 common tempos. When storms pass and no betrayal follows, they toss flowers into receding foam and shout thanks to the unseen smith made of polyps and prophecy. They may never meet the fisherman who rowed me out that day. Age has stiffened his hands. He no longer sails beyond the lagoon. But at night, he leans above water and says he can still feel the tower's vibrations travelling through the oars stacked inside his shed, like a cat purring somewhere far below. As for me, I lecture at universities where lasers measure ice flows and algorithms predict currents. Students ask whether the coral clock is allegory or artifact. I show them satellite images, a slender tooth of pale fire piercing cyan swirls. Then I play an audio file recorded from the Concha 3 deep pulses followed by 2 quick ones. The auditorium sound system never does it justice. The bass filters chop the lowest frequencies, the ones that quiver your lungs. Still, some listeners place their palms over their stomachs as if steadying seasickness. I watch their eyes widen, not at the myths, but at the recognition in their own organs. The body knows the ocean's metronome even when the brain refuses. I finish each talk the same way. If you ever find yourself upon that reef, do not ask what the tower is made of or who built it. Ask instead what promises you have forgotten to keep with the water that keeps you alive. Listen, count. Then decide if you are willing to honor the arithmetic of the tides. Afterward, a few linger to say they intend to voyage there, to hear for themselves. I do not dissuade them. The coral clock tower counts for its own sake, indifferent to witness, but it welcomes any ear humble enough to heed its warnings. The ocean's betrayal is only half of the story. The other half is whether we betray ourselves by staying death. Some nights, in tiny apartments far from surf, I wake to silence so absolute it startles. No traffic, no heating pipes, only the hush between my breaths. In that void, I sense the distance of every wave Olaun measures. Then, faint yet undeniable, comes the rhythm. 3 slow, 2 fast. I rise, cross to the window and smell nothing but city dust. Still, I jot the time down. The next day, if tide gauges somewhere behave oddly, I email coordinates to those who listen. In this way, the myth migrates, from conch shell to data cloud, from heartbeat to hyperlink. Yet no transmission quite equals standing barefoot on living stone, feeling the world's oceans compress their immeasurable sigh into a single steady drum. The tower endures, alive at that thin border where certainty dissolves into salt. It counts, it cautions, and until we remember to keep pace, its pulse will echo through strangers like me, who once accepted the invitation of an old man's skiff and found within coral a chronicle vast as water, fragile as breath.